Alrighty. Whoa. Okay. Scared myself there a little bit. All right. It's 7 p.m. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about tonight, so we're starting on the dot. Couple housekeeping notes as we get started. Just as a reminder, this is going to be the flow of the rest of our class. So tonight we're going to finish up the actual structure of Genesis 11. And then we're going to start talking about how Genesis 1 through 11 echoes throughout the rest of the Bible. So tonight we're going to focus on specifically inside of the rest of Genesis, because that's particularly important. And then starting next Sunday, we'll start talking about how Genesis 1 through 11 really echoes throughout the rest of Exodus through Revelation. So we'll probably do Old Testament one Sunday, New Testament the second Sunday. Depends on how much we get through each class. Michael's going to do kind of a summary class, and then we're going to do a Q&A as our last class on April 1st. If you want to submit a question to the Q&A, you can scan the QR code. If you're a member here, you should have gotten an email with a link as well that you can find the form and submit questions. Anything from Genesis 1:1 to 11:32 is fair game. So any questions you got, submit them. We'll talk about them. Okay, so we're going to be talking about Shem's descendants tonight. Before we do that, let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for your word and for the wisdom that you've placed there and for the story of your plan to redeem mankind from sin. We ask that you would help us to see that more clearly tonight and to love you more because of what you've done for us. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. Let me find my correct notes here. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about Shem's descendants. This starts in Genesis chapter 11, starting in verse 10. I just kind of want to know, hopefully you guys had a chance to look at this on your own a little bit. Nope, not yet. Looking at this genealogy, what kind of things did you guys observe about Shem's genealogy, maybe as it relates to other genealogies that we've already seen in the beginning of Genesis? Anything stick out to you guys in this genealogy? Great. Okay, so the lifespans of people is getting logarithmically shorter, I think it is, right? Where like Noah lives 900 years, Shem lives 600 years, then it goes down to around 400 years, and then by the end of it, people are living less than 200 years, which is still a pretty long time to live. But you see that the lifespans of people are getting shorter. Why might that be significant? Okay, so God said it was going to happen. You're basing that on what?
3 chapters ago, said you're going to live 120 years, could be the days of man.
Okay, so that's one way you can take that verse. God says it's going to happen. Nobody has lived, or lots of people are still living longer than 120 years. So it seems like that's about the flood, when the flood's going to happen. But for sure, we're seeing some effects of what God also said was going to happen, which was if you sin and you eat the fruit, you're going to die, right? And so not only is man like physically dying at some point, but the amount of time that they're living is actually getting cut down. Yeah. Anything else stick out to you guys about this genealogy? Yes, Adam.
I think it's of these that we've had just in the last chapter and a half. The others don't really give all of the year details. So Shem was 100 years old, father so-and-so, then the Rapshat, father 35 years, father somebody. I think the others, they don't give that much detail. They just talk about their brother and father.
Oh, yeah, right. So in Genesis 10, it just kind of says, this guy had these kids, and those kids had these kids, and sometimes it doesn't even tell us like who their grandkids were from all of their kids. It just kind of gives us a big list of names, whereas this is giving us a very structured accounting of how things are progressing. Have we seen that anywhere else in Genesis?
basically the same structure as the Genesis 5 table,
Yeah.
except it's missing and so he lived, that's all the days of Mahalalel, where 895 years and he died. And
Right.
that structure is the only thing that's missing from the Genesis 11 section, but otherwise it's pretty much identical.
Yep. So the structure matches, basically the first half matches exactly the same. In Genesis 5, it also says, and his years were such and such years, and he died, right? And these guys are not called out as dying. Why do you think that is? Yeah, Debbie.
Well, in Genesis 5, it was chronicling up to the time of Noah. Now it's chronicling up to Abraham, and then all of the Jews, of course, are going to have to go and trace their lineage back to Abraham. So they'll also go back to Noah, which will go back to Adam.
Great. So you call it a good thing here, which is we're now entering into a different time period. And really, while the Genesis 5 is building up to Noah, this one is building up to Abraham. I think that is a big part of why it's not calling out death. The thing that it's mainly emphasizing is, these people are having kids. They're having other sons and daughters, which is going to be really significant when we get to Abraham's wife, Sarai, right? I think probably also we kind of know the story, right? We don't have to be told that all these people are dying because we've started to see this pattern over and over again. We know that they're dying. There's one other kind of big thing that's significant about this genealogy. Anything big stick out to anybody?
It says that it gives a major event. We've seen God doing a lot of things to the earth, how the earth would be different from the flood, but now there's another event here that it says in his son Peleg's days the earth was divided. Don't know exactly what that means, but it's enough for God to tell us that.
Right.
So if it wasn't significant, it probably wouldn't be there.
Yeah.
But it probably does explain a lot of stuff about how do people get everywhere where they are.
Yeah. So a lot of people think that reference to Peleg and the earth being divided there is a reference to the events of the Tower of Babel, right? I think that's a pretty good hypothesis. It doesn't make it explicit, so it's possible that this is referencing some other event that we're just not told about in Genesis. But I think that's pretty plausible to say that the dividing here is connected to the Babel because that's where you see a bunch of people dividing. Yeah, Michael.
The second genealogy of Shem, we've already had a genealogy of Shem, and then we have this one again, and Peleg is the kind of the dividing point, where the other genealogy went to a different line and kind of through this line.
Yeah, so what happens in particular, like where we split? So you've got, in Genesis 10, you've got two sons, Peleg and Joktan, and Joktan has a bunch of kids, and then what's the very next event that happens? Tower of Babel, right? So kind of structurally, the line of Joktan, although it's not chronological, the line of Joktan leads us to Tower of Babel and rebellion against God. We kind of split here and very conspicuously don't even talk about Joktan. Now it's all about Peleg, and that leads us to Abraham. You see how that is kind of structured so that these two trajectories mirror each other? Kind of like this same thing we've talked about from Genesis 5 of seed of the woman versus seed of the serpent, right? Two trajectories for humankind and where they going to lead. Michael, do you want to talk about your men of the name thing and Shem?
Oh, yeah, so we talked about how Shem's name means ham. And
Means name.
It means name.
Yeah.
Not ham. Shem's name means name. And so the story of the Tower of Babel, what are they trying to do? They're trying to make a Shem name for themselves. And it's sandwiched in between these two genealogies of name. So it's almost like God is trying to highlight, hey, you guys are trying to make a name for yourselves. Let me show you who really has the name and it all ends up making him, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we've got people trying to make a name, a Shem for themselves in Hebrew, and then you've got this guy named Shem, who has his own lineage, and that's going to end in Abraham. and God's going to talk in chapter 12. I think, Allison, you pointed this out last week, that one of the things God says that he's going to do is make his name great, right? So Abraham's going to have a great Shem in contrast to the Tower of Babel guys trying to make a Shem for themselves. Okay. The last thing we want to notice here before we move on is, did anybody count how many generations there are in this from Shem to Abraham?
I said I bet
Michael probably did. Did anybody besides Michael count it? Yes, Laura.
I was kind of, no,
Okay.
but it was 11.
Right, so Noah is 10th from Adam. So Shem's number 11. Okay, so what number from Adam is Abraham? 11? He's 10. Yeah. So you have 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Adam's number 1, Noah's number 10. Shem is kind of the starting point here. Shem is number 1 or 11, and then Abraham. I'm getting so confused. Abraham's number 10, or in the total span, he's 20. Why might that be important?
So the idea of generations like coming into their own and replaying the story that have already been passed. That happens like in a small case in each generation, where each generation comes to like their own tree and makes their own choice. But then also if you zoom out just a little bit to the 10 generations between Adam and Noah, Adam and then all the people in between and then Noah, they sort of set their own pattern of story, and so now we are expecting to see some version of a replay of that, with starting with Shem as a fake Adam, as a sort of Adam prime, and then ending with Abraham as a Noah prime.
Right. So there's this parallel between kind of the roles that Noah's fulfilling and what Abraham's fulfilling. And Abraham's going to be like kind of a new Noah in chapter 12, where he's God's special chosen one, and he's going to get a promise of blessing, just like Noah does, and also just like Adam does. If Abraham's number 20 from Adam, who's number 21? Isaac, right? So the child of promise is going to be the 3 times 7th generation from Adam. Does that kind of shine a spotlight on him as a pretty significant figure in the narrative? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Abraham. I want to move through this pretty quick, so we got some cool other stuff to talk about tonight. The last, I think, 6 verses of Genesis 11 are all about Abraham's dad Terah and their family. So what things stick out to you in the end of Genesis 11 that might be significant? Because this is transitioning us out of really kind of this first major block in Genesis 1 through 11 into the Abraham narrative. That's going to be the second major block for the next 15 chapters or so. So what sticks out to you about the very end of Genesis 11? Yeah, Franco.
You see this aspect of life not being able to be propagated, and the story of Sarah not being able to conceive.
Yeah, so it's very explicit about the fact that Sarai can't have any kids, right? Which is a pretty sharp contrast to the genealogy we just read, where everybody's having kids and it's going great, and everybody's having sons and daughters, and then you get to Abraham and his wife, and no sons and daughters, and that's a problem. And that's going to be actually the central tension of the next 10 chapters of the Bible is, hey, when is this child of promise going to come? Because God's made some pretty big promises, and there's no heir to fulfill those, right? So that's a huge thread that's starting right here in these verses. Anything else stick out to you guys? Adam.
Well, there's also this pseudo-adoption that happens where Lot becomes Abram's son in many ways, and Abram fulfills the position that Haran should have been in if he hadn't died. To me, that's a very interesting idea given where this story is going to end up in the end, where we all get adopted.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and Lot's a really interesting figure. He's super complicated in the Genesis narrative. He almost plays this role of like an anti-Abraham, right? Where a lot of times he's trying to do the right thing just the same as Abraham, but it never quite goes the right way for Lot. So their relationship is really, I think, complicated and interesting as well. So we meet Lot here. Mara, you had a hand up.
I was going to say something similar, but over at the places that they settled, or wealthy city, or idol worship was Ur, and then I read where Iran was a trade city, and they were supposed to be going to Canaan, but they didn't finish their journey there.
Yeah. So I think I have a slide for that. Yeah. So you notice that they start down here in Ur, and then they are trying to get over here to Canaan, but they go up here and they kind of get stuck or just stop in Haran. So you see this thread where like this exodus to the promised land is supposed to be happening, but there's interestingly some wandering that's happening, but they don't actually make it into the promised land. They get stopped outside, and part of Abraham's story is going to be all about his family leaves and tries to go to Canaan on their own. It seems like Terah is the guy who's maybe spearheading that, and that doesn't really work. They kind of just wind up outside of the promised land, and it's going to take God's intervention to actually bring Abraham and his family into the promised land. Anything else stick out to you about this short end of the, yeah, Callie.
Those two thoughts together, it took God's intervention to get them into the promised land. It took God's intervention for them to continue filling the earth and continuing to fulfill that commandment of be fruitful and multiply.
Yeah, so God is the one who is driving the whole story here. Yeah, anything else stick out to you guys? Yeah, Emily.
Interesting that Abram originates from Ur, which is like the Chaldeans is that Babylon.
Yeah, so you notice like geographically, like this is the whole region where the Babylonian Empire is going to be, right? And we've already seen some connections to Babel and the idea of Babylon. And so far, their track record in Genesis, since we met them earlier this chapter, has been unilaterally bad. So that's where Abraham is coming out of. Abraham is coming out of this world of kind of men exalting themselves and making a name for themselves, and he's going to be the one who trusts in God to make his name great. The last thing, this is kind of an interesting thing. There's 8 people in these verses, right? So there's Terah, Abram, Nahor, Haran, and then all their wives. So Milcah and Iscah and Sarai. So 8 people, which is a weird number of people. It's the same number of people who are on the ark, which kind of suggests like, okay, we have another little ark like family here that's going to be preserved by God. But usually we're seeing like lists of 10, like we've been seeing that in the genealogies, which kind of makes us wonder like, okay, well, like where's person number 9 and 10? And the composition here of this being 8 people is pretty dependent on this person, Iscah, who plays no role in the entire rest of the Bible and seems to just be here for the purpose of making this an 8-person kind of grouping here, right? Which suggests that we're supposed to ask, okay, well, who's numbers 9 and 10 in this kind of family? It's going to be Ishmael, the child of not promise, and then number 10 is going to be Isaac, the child of promise, right? So you see this is kind of setting up some suspense as we're closing out this story of Genesis 1 through 11, also setting up some suspense for what's going to happen next with Abraham. Does all that make sense? Any kind of like last reflections on Genesis 11? Yes, Wayne.
I have a reflection on the map, if you put it back up there. You know, the mountains of Ararat are north of Haran. When it landed, we don't know where, but it was up there north of Haran. So some of the people probably stopped at this place as others went on to another place. But this is pretty much the land of the Shemites. then
Yeah.
is there. So it kind of explains, well, how did Abraham get down here if his uncle was up there?
Yeah, there's this whole journey that kind of goes through. And you notice that some of Abraham's relatives, like Nahor, his family is going to become significant later in Genesis, way later. But somebody significant is going to come from his family. Okay, any other thoughts on Genesis 11? Okay, so now we're going to kind of shift gears. And I want us to kind of start talking about Genesis 1 through 11 in the rest of Genesis. So we've kind of seen that Genesis is very intricately constructed work of writing, right? This is not put together in a slapdash kind of way. Like, God through Moses has really constructed this very intricately, and you're supposed to pay a lot of attention to all the details. And we've kind of seen how some of the rhetorical devices and literary writing techniques that are in the Hebrew literature here are not necessarily what we would use in English. So one of the places we see that a lot is like word plays, right? We've talked a lot about Hebrew language in this class, and that's kind of given us a deeper understanding of what's going on. And there are like word plays and spelling parallels and words that sound the same, and the literature tends to use that a lot to emphasize points. We don't really do that in kind of modern English writing, so that might not be on our radar as something to look for. Another thing I want us to kind of start thinking about now is the idea of, I'm going to call it motifs. And I'm going to use this term much more broadly than it actually means, but I think it's a useful term for our discussion, right? So in music, a motif is a little kind of melody of notes that is connected to something in the story. So you see this in like opera, or we're going to talk about movies tonight because that's kind of what we can relate to. And it'll play this little like melody of notes, and that connects you to, you know, something that's happening on screen. And then whenever you hear that little melody, it kind of layers on the ideas together. So let's talk about some examples of this. So everybody knows like the Imperial March of Darth Vader, right? And anytime it plays, it's this very menacing thing in the original trilogy of Star Wars, right? And everybody knows the tune and goes, oh, Darth Vader's coming, right? So in the prequel trilogy, anytime you see Anakin, as he's doing stuff and progressing towards the dark side, John Williams works in the notes of the Imperial March, dun, 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 but he kind of changes up the vibe in the song. And so even when you see Anakin as like a little kid, those notes are in the score, and it kind of reminds you, oh yeah, this cute little kid is going to kind of journey progressively to the dark side. Another space you see this, like if you've seen Up, right? There's this iconic intro to the movie where Carl and Ellie have this great life together, and there's these woodwinds, da-na-na-na, and it's like super joyful, right? But then when the sad scenes come, the same notes are played, but really like slowly and softly on a piano. And so it takes the same notes and layers over a different emotional texture, and so you connect and kind of compare the two things that are happening before and after, and it makes you connect those two ideas. Does that make sense how that works in music? Okay, cool. So let's talk about how else this works. We're not going to talk about Hamilton because Michael said I shouldn't. So like you might see this in like Lord of the Rings, there's different types of repeated scenarios, right? So in Lord of the Rings, the ring tempts people, and every time there's a character being tempted by the ring, you kind of find out something about how that character acts and thinks, and it compares and contrasts these other characters to one another, right? So there's these repeated motif of the ring temptation scene. It might also be like a location or a setting, right? So in Lion King, it's Pride Rock. It's symbolic of, hey, this is the throne of the king. So whoever's on top of Pride Rock is the one who's the king of the Pride Land. So it starts with Simba, foreshadowed as the future king, but then Scar becomes king. There's this big showdown on top of Pride Rock for who's going to be king, and then it ends with Simba on top of Pride Rock, right? So whoever's on top of Pride Rock, that's how we tell throughout the story who's in charge. Also in Lion King, there's these two like repeated situations that are played off of each other, right? So there's Mufasa killing Scar, spoiler alert, and Mufasa killing, or almost killing Simba, right? And the way these two situations work out is differently, and they're played off of each other in the movie. Does that kind of make sense, how repeated situations or repeated locations or settings kind of call together different scenes? Okay. The last one we'll talk about is like kind of repeated imagery, right? So in the Toy Story movies, all the toys have Andy's name written on their foot, and that takes on a different emotional meaning throughout the movies, right? So in the beginning, Woody's like, I'm top dog, I got Andy's name. But then Buzz gets his name on there, and now Woody looks at it and he feels like, oh, I'm second rate because Buzz has the same thing, right? It gets painted over in Toy Story 2, and that's a really significant pivotal moment for Woody, right? So every time we see the name and things happening to the name, it helps us contextualize how the character is developing. Does all that make sense? Okay, so hopefully that wasn't like an over-explanation. So the first thing I want us to talk about is what like motifs from Genesis 1 through 11 should we be looking for in Genesis 12 through 50? So what examples of things that we've seen in Genesis 1 through 11 do you think are going to repeat in 12 through 50? Anybody got any ideas? Yeah, Josh.
Saul, look, tuck.
Okay, so we're going to see, like, are there any stories where people see something desirable, they take it, and then even they like give it to somebody else, right? Are we going to see a repeated pattern of those words happening over and over again? Yeah, great. What else?
Conflict between close-knit families.
Okay, so conflict between family members, we see that primarily with Cain and Abel, but also a little bit between Adam and Eve, right? But there's this huge theme of conflict between brothers that shows up in the Cain and Abel story. Maybe that's going to repeat. What else? Yeah, Franco.
Covenant, not like unilateral covenant, continuing this covenant.
Yeah, okay, so covenants being formed, and we might add to that also like the idea of like blessings and cursings, right? Like God really like blesses Adam and Eve in the beginning, and then there's also curses that happen after they sin. Are we going to see covenants involved there and blessings and cursings involved like along with that? What else? Yes, Franco.
Continued desire for evil and rebellion towards God.
Okay, so like we might see like a desire for evil. We might see stories where people are tested or tempted, and are they going to succeed or fail in that, right? We might see a repeats of basically the garden and the temptation of Adam and Eve, right? What else? Yes, Mara.
Older siblings serving the younger sibling.
Okay,
Power over the younger sibling.
great. So not just
The younger serving the older, sorry.
yeah, not just conflict between brothers, but also like, are we going to see situations where the subordinate or the younger is actually going to be the one who is primary or superior? Great. Any other ideas of like themes we should look for? Yes.
He destroyed the earth with the flood because of evil. The Canaanites are evil. They're going to be destroyed.
Great. Okay, so are we going to see scenes of like judgment or destruction? We might almost say like decreation and recreation, like we saw with the flood. Adam.
Salvation. There's lots of stories of destruction, but then many stories within that. Lot's family gets saved. Joseph's family gets saved from the famine. Abram, I guess, actually saves Lot twice. There's lots of these stories where the natural conclusion would be, well, that's the end of that. But then what actually happens is there's like an underdog salvation sort of story.
Great. So stories about salvation or deliverance, just like we see that in the flood story, we see that happen. Yeah, Michael.
Deception.
Yeah. Yeah. Are we going to see people act like the serpent in any of these stories? The last one I would add, I think you guys hit on all the ones that I had written down. The last one I would add is like, we're going to look for like, are there any pictures of Eden or paradise or the garden or kind of peace and harmony with God, right? Do we see any of that repeat? Okay, so we're going to kind of experiment now. I want us to start in chapter 12. What we're going to kind of do is I want to let you guys talk. Hopefully you guys had a chance to go through Genesis before this and see any of these connections in the rest of Genesis. So I want to start with Genesis 12 because I think this will help us get the picture of what we're looking for. But in Genesis 12, did anybody happen to look at Genesis 12 and notice anything in Genesis 12 that calls back to Genesis 1 through 11 in any way? Yeah, Crystal. Great. So you're talking about like Abraham. He's going to be blessed and multiplied and become a great nation, right? Great. Yes. So very similar blessings there. What else? Yeah, Laura.
God giving the land.
Yep. Okay. So there's a land. Yeah, just like the garden in the land of Eden. Yep. Franco, you had a hand up. You were going to say the same one. Okay. What else? Yeah, Josh.
People calling upon the Lord.
Okay, so people calling upon the Lord, Abraham is going to fulfill that role, right? And very similar to what we've seen with like Enoch and Noah, right? What about this story where Abram and Sarai go down to Egypt and they lie about it? Yeah, Mara.
Abram's not trusting God to fulfill his promises, contracts to Noah, trusting to fulfill.
Great, so I just locked that, luckily. Anand knew that I was going to do that and wrote down the password for me. He's on it. Yes, Emily.
Also, this to me reminded me of Adam and Eve when after the sin in the garden they did a hide and lie about it. So they're afraid they hide. And here, Sarah.
Great. So they're kind of they're acting, they're hiding themselves. They're also acting as deceivers, right? So you notice what happens in this story. Abraham's worried about the Egyptians seeing Sarah because she's beautiful in appearance. She's desirable. And so what happens is the Egyptians see that Sarah is very beautiful, and they praise her to Pharaoh, and she's taken into Pharaoh's house, right? And then Pharaoh finds out what's going on, and he says to Abram, "What have you done?" Where have we heard that phrase before? Genesis 3, right? So you see how this whole story is a little replay of Genesis 3, where Sarai is acting as the forbidden fruit. Pharaoh is the one who's being tempted and is also kind of playing the role of the righteous person. He doesn't know what's going on. And so he says to Abram, "What have you done?" Abram is in the role of who in this story? He's the snake, right? So what we have is a repeat of Genesis 3, but now you have Abraham, who's supposed to be the guy, the new Noah, the new Adam, and it's not that he's failing the test like Adam did. He's actually the one presenting the object of temptation and acting like the snake. Do you see how this continues on the patterns of Genesis 3, but then it kind of flips them in a new way to help us understand the story at a deeper level? Like, this isn't just Abraham kind of making a really bad decision in a tough situation. It's Abraham acting like the serpent. And, okay, this is the guy who's supposed to trust in God. First thing we see him do is act like a snake. Seems like he's got some work to do on his faith, right? Does that make sense? Yes, Michael.
Yeah, and there's the tension in the story. God just promised him all these things, and how does Abram turn around and doesn't trust him? But God is bound.
Right. And you notice that because Abraham leaves with a bunch of good stuff, and we're kind of like, well, that doesn't seem very cool. He's like the jerk in this story. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. We're running out of time faster than I hoped we would. Did you guys have a chance to go through the rest of Genesis? Hopefully you skimmed it and notice any of these connections to Genesis 1 through 11 that kind of help us see the kind of melody of the overture here. What stuck out to you guys? We'll kind of jump around and look at it together. Mara, you got something?
There's whenever a covenant was made, there was a sign. Also, after a promise was given by God, there was always some type of sacrifice or an altar.
Great. So we might see that in like, let's see, chapter 15, right? These promises get repeated. And then I think Abraham, does he offer a sacrifice here, right? He cuts everything in half, and there's this covenant that's formed between God and Abraham. And it's almost very similar to like the marriage covenant between Adam and Eve, right? Abraham, just like Adam, falls into a deep sleep, and there's this covenant that's formed. Great, so there's this repeated pattern of covenant and sacrifice on altars. There's a bunch of stories like that. What else stuck out to you guys, connections you saw? Franco?
God using a righteous man to plead on behalf of wicked.
Great.
And story of Lot, Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about that. You're talking about like Abraham in the end of Genesis chapter 18? Or you're talking about Lot in 19?
Yep.
So Abraham kind of plays this role of intercessor. Anybody else notice any connections in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah with anything that we saw before? Yes, Josh?
It's the flood story all over again.
Okay, so talk about that.
It starts out the exact same way. Sodom and Gomorrah starts out with like this weird thing, and
Great.
the angels and that weird.
Yep.
So it's that weird. That's a connection. And then it's just the whole repeat of God like finding favor only in Lot, barely. So he missed saves Lot, his family. And then it's a deacon new creation with all Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it lists it right there. The plants died, the animals died, the people died, all that. And then it ends the exact same way. Parents and child relationship, that should not be.
Yep, spot on. A+ for Josh. Right, so there's a huge connection between Sodom and Gomorrah and the flood story, right? Starts off the exact same way, where you have weird relationships or illicit sexual relationships between humans and angels. You have this prophesied destruction that's warned about. There's one guy who's going to be delivered through this. There's a lot of language here that's especially obvious in the Hebrew, that like Lot's house is like this little ark that where they're saved from the flood of the evil men of Sodom, and then God's going to deliver Lot out of it. Sodom is decreated, but then it ends with this weird story about an incestual relationship between family members, right? We got Noah and Ham after the flood, and then you've got Lot and his daughters after this story. So repeating the same pattern over and over again between these two stories. Yes, Emily?
And even before that, the verse 20 of chapter 18 is, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, I will see if they've like done according to the outcry that has come to me, which is still that, the great destruction has like come up before the Lord. That once again shows up, and that one also shows up throughout the rest of the Bible.
Great, so we have this idea of an outcry coming up. We see that in the flood story. We also see that in Cain and Abel, right? Abel's blood cries out. And then you see God going down here, just like he does in the Tower of Babel, to see what's going on. Callie?
Abraham is invited to intercede for people. They're invited to intercede before, after the flood.
Yeah, great. So Abraham intercedes here. Noah offers this atoning sacrifice after the flood, functioning in the same role again. Yeah. What other stuff did you guys see anywhere in Genesis? Yes, Chip.
The conflict, as you mentioned Cain and Abel, the conflict between Cain and Abel repeats itself between Ishmael and Isaac.
Yeah.
And then again between Joseph and his brothers.
Yep. So
Jacob and Esau.
yes.
Wait, Moab and Ammon and Israel. So there's a continuum.
Yes, so there's tons of examples of this conflict between brothers, like you said, Ishmael and Isaac, and really that is actually between their mothers, right? Like conflict between the rival wives. But yes, conflict between Esau and Jacob. Let me see if I got it in the right spot. In chapter 25 or 27, I think. What Esau says after he finds out what's happened, is he's like getting ready to kill Jacob, just like Cain's ready to kill Abel, and Jacob has to flee because of that. And then you have this huge conflict between Joseph and his brothers that is essentially the central tension of the last third of the book, or quarter of the book, basically. Yeah. What other connections do you guys notice? Yeah, Chip.
Emphasize the outcome of that. Cain and Abel, the outcome is that God says that his blood cries out. He preached a whole lesson on what does it cry out? Or not a whole lesson, but at the end of the lesson, so what is it crying out? It's crying out mercy and forgiveness. And you think about Joseph and his brothers at the end of time. What happens with Joseph? Through Joseph is mercy and salvation, that was already mentioned. And so each of those examples leads to deliverance.
Yeah. What other connections do you guys see in Genesis? Yes, Mara.
God remembered Rachel, he remembered Noah. Both instances, the earth was blessed. Joseph in saving humanity throughout the famine, and of course Noah saving all humanity.
Right, so Rachel is unable to have kids, and then I think in verse 22 of chapter 30, God remembers Rachel. Well, where have we seen that before? God remembered Noah. So there's this parallel of this covenant relationship. Through Rachel is going to come the chosen one. In this case, it's going to be Joseph, who's going to deliver all the brothers, right? What other connections? Yes, Franco.
You see the little pictures of Eden, even in Egypt itself.
Yeah.
Land of Goshen.
Yeah.
So you start seeing those little pockets, Laban's farm, little Edens just pop out. God's people.
Yeah, so this is really cool. In Genesis 47, right, the Israelites, who are 70 people at this point, come to Egypt and are delivered from the famine, and Pharaoh says, hey, let me give you this land. What's actually really cool about this is he says, they're going to be in charge of my livestock, right? So you have the Israelites being put in dominion over the animals, over the creation again. It's this little picture of Eden, yeah. What else? Yes, Allison.
Picture of like east equaling movement away from God.
Yeah,
That
great.
happens over and over again. Genesis 3, Adam and Eve are driven east out of Eden. Cain settles east of Eden. People move east to build Bethel. Lot is east towards Sodom.
Yep. Lot's a great one, right? Because he goes east to settle in Sodom. And actually, he says Lot journeyed east, and he sees that the Jordan Valley was well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord. So, and he sees it, and he takes it for himself, right? So Lot sees a land, he says, that looks like my own little spot of Eden. And so he journeys east, just like Cain, to take for himself his own little slice of Eden. And what happens? He winds up in a flood of Sodom and Gomorrah. Great. Yes, he also journeys down. Right. Does that make sense? And that kind of foreshadows here of, okay, like Lot not making a good decision here. Anything else that got you guys? Yeah, Franco.
Preservation of a genealogy that provides protection.
Yeah. Yes. So through this whole thing, one of the things you'll see, Jacob's a good example of this, right? So the big theme, or one of the big themes in Jacob's story, is he's a snake. He's a deceiver. And basically there's story after story of him trying to deceive people, and then a lot of times, particularly his uncle Laban, double crosses him and like deceives the deceiver, right? And so Jacob is supposed to be the one who is descended from Isaac. He's the chosen one. He's the one who's going to get the blessing. But what continually happens is he's acting like a snake, and it takes him a long time to learn how to stop acting like a snake and trust in God. Does all this kind of make sense to y'all? This tracking about how there's a ton more stuff that we could talk about, but this kind of track with y'all of how these patterns from Genesis 1 through 11, these motifs repeat throughout the story. And what's happening is they're asking us to remember when we see Jacob being a liar, oh, it's not just Jacob being a liar and that's bad. We see him acting like the offspring of the serpent, and now there's this cosmic spiritual tension in the line that is supposed to bring the Messiah of the guy who's supposed to be offspring of the woman, acting like offspring of the serpent, right? Or when we see Abraham acting like that, or when we see people in these little Eden pictures, that we're supposed to connect that back to Genesis 1 through 11 and see that the core themes and ideas that God is laying out in his literary overture here are carrying through the rest of the biblical narrative. That make sense? Okay, well, nobody's saying it's not making sense, so that's good. Okay, so what I'd like for us to do next class is start thinking about this in the rest of the Bible. So maybe start with the Old Testament and just think about, hey, I've read through Genesis 1 through 11. Are there any stories that I can think of in the Old Testament or passages in the Old Testament that maybe speak a lot about like Eden imagery or tell a lot of a story that reminds me of the things that happen in the flood or the things that happen in the garden and the temptation? Think about some of those examples from the Old Testament, and we'll get together next class and kind of start to see how this echoes not just inside of Genesis, but throughout the rest of Scripture. Cool, thanks.